Alexander. I'm an aspiring art music composer. My piece is called Capitol Hill, and it's about quite a lot of things, really. It's sort of a concoction of my views on things to do with politics at the moment, and just the direction we want our Australian society to go into. Well, Capitol Hill is for chamber orchestra, single winds, double brass in half the cases and single brass in the other half, and a few percussion and a piano and a harp and reduced strings, but enough that makes quite an impact. Quite a nice compositional force to write for. Challenging, but rewarding, I think. I'd like people to hear craft and complexity, but not complexity that's alienating or elite. I would like people to hopefully hear that there's time that goes into my work. I do like to work by hand as much as possible. I think the pencil is far less inhibiting than the mouse, and working with the page is far more enlightening than looking at a screen. But that's just me. I know a lot of people who use digital software and programs to their advantage, and that's a big bonus of the 21st century. It's this sort of multiplicity of compositional systems, and everyone can take away something from each other, which is great as well. I like to infuse a lot of harmony within my music, so I often spend quite a lot of time actually working out the notes, and I suppose harmony and frequencies and pitches and these sorts of things are more prominent in my work at the moment than, say, rhythm, and that's just something that I'm interested in.
Hello, my name is Sam Wu. My piece is called Mass Transit, and it's inspired by Shanghai's elaborate metro system. I spent quite a bit of time in Shanghai growing up, and so I really have a lot of images in my head of taking the trains and going to, and just that idea of being able to go on public transit and be taken to so many different kinds of places, whether that's the airport or skyscrapers or parks and whatnot. And I think what really inspires me musically about this idea of a network or a metro system is just all those interconnecting lines, including these sort of interchange stations where multiple lines meet, and just how kind of complex and kind of dynamic equilibrium that whole system is. There's always a point where even when it's something at first is a visual impetus, that there has to be a point where it actually transforms or is translated into something that's sonic or oral. But nevertheless, I think even when I'm listening, or even when I'm trying to hear in my own mind, right, when I'm trying to compose, when I'm trying to imagine sound, that I think there's always going to be some sort of visual association that happens. And I'm not sure exactly why or how that is. And I think that is perhaps the most subjective element of music making, is like someone else hearing the same exact piece or the same exact sound might have a very different image in mind. And that's not an issue to me, I think. But I think what is interesting to me is that there's almost a seamless connection between that or the visual and that oral sense. I think even beyond the idea of what inspired the piece or what the music is depicting pictorially or visually, I think ultimately I hope to emotionally move the audience. And I think that's what makes music such a great art form, is how directly it speaks to our emotions in a nonverbal way. And in that same way, I think what I ultimately hope is that audiences can really be transported into that atmosphere, and particularly because my piece is divided into those movements, to kind of get a sense of that changing atmosphere, that each little world is kind of almost a little sub-world of the larger world that the piece exists in. The computer has something called MIDI, which generates, I guess, synthesized sound, kind of simulation of an orchestral sound. And it's actually quite easy as a composer to be fooled by that, right? Because the computer can execute a very difficult thing flawlessly. Whereas in real life, there might be real life, like physical limitations that might make a passage not even possible on a certain instrument, right? If it's too low or too high and so forth. But in my case, I really try to take a step back from that, from that function on the computer, and really still try to hear it in my head. But I also recognize that it's gonna take like a lifetime's work probably to actually minimize that gap between what we can imagine the sound to be and what we actually hear in this space. And of course, it's always different with every. It depends on the player, it depends on the space, on where you sit in the space. So there's so many factors that, of course, go into how we experience that first rehearsal. And as you can imagine, like that first downbeat of that first rehearsal is always the most nerve-wracking, because that's kind of like the judgment moment, the moment of truth, when suddenly everything we've worked so hard on is laid there bare for the players to play and for us to hear in real life.
I'm Georgia Scott, and I just really like to compose music that can explore a story and kind of tell a story around topics that might often be hard to express using language. The piece is called Mechanical Dreamscapes. It explores an idea of AI dreaming, so artificial intelligence dreaming, and that was something that I thought was quite novel and interesting, and I mean could be quite divisive in some circumstances, so I thought it might be something interesting to explore sonically. I was just kind of going around the internet as you do, and I saw this article that was talking about how Google was giving AI dream sequences as a means of helping them consolidate learning and learn more about the world, and I just thought that was so interesting because it seemed like it was something that you'd hear about in some sort of dystopian sci-fi fantasy, but it was true, and I thought, wow, how interesting that they're putting a human experience onto a machine, and wouldn't that be something interesting to explore through music? When I was writing the piece, I wanted to evoke this idea of the threshold between waking and sleep, and I wanted to do that in as many different ways as possible. So whether that be dynamically, so moving from very quiet passages and swelling and then back into almost silence, or whether that be harmonically, so moving from one note just up and down semitones and using glissandi, things like that as well, having semitone clashes in there, that kind of sonic threshold of which note is this. The first movement of my piece is called Hypnagogic Precipice, and so it's that idea of you're just falling asleep and then you suddenly get jerked awake with this hypnagogic jerk, and so that was really interesting to explore sonically as well, kind of having lots of clashes together and semitone movements and things kind of moving out of very quiet into kind of louder dynamics and then back into almost silence. So just all of those thresholds in different ways. I'm paraphrasing here, but when I was doing my research, there are a couple of quotes that really excited me when I was writing this piece, and one was from Min-Soo Kang in his book Sublime Dreams of Living Machines, and he talks about that there's going to be a gradual fusion of human and machine, so much so that there will be no line between them. And I thought that was really interesting because that's that idea of threshold as well, where is human, where is machine. And the other quote that I thought was really interesting as well was from Elizabeth Bowman Herring, and she was talking about this frightening alien territory that's also incredibly fertile creatively in that moment, before you fall asleep or just as you're waking up. And I thought that was a really interesting way of describing it, as fertile creatively but also alien and terrifying. And so that was quite exciting for me to springboard ideas from.
My name's Alex Turley and I'm a composer. So the piece I've written today is called In a Dream Falling. It's for a reduced chamber orchestra. The piece is sort of about dreaming and the way that time and reality feels in dreams. So when I've been composing the piece, I've sort of used that as an inspiration. It's a really fun piece. I'm really pushing myself a lot. I kind of thought of this as an opportunity to try out sort of everything that I've ever wanted to try for an orchestra, which sounds ambitious, I know, but I thought it was the right thing to do. Around the time that I got this commission, I was having this recurring dream that I was falling sort of from space down to Earth. Very traumatic dream. I used to wake up in the middle of it really discombobulated. But when I settled down, I thought that it would make a cool piece. I thought that it would be really cool to represent the idea of falling in a dream musically. And so that was kind of the seed of the idea that started this whole piece. For me, I like connecting with audiences and I like giving them things that feel familiar and mixing those with things that feel unfamiliar, because I think that that is how you take people on a little bit of a journey. And in terms of what I want my music to evoke, I think I play around with time and space a lot in my work, and I like the feeling of time being suspended. That's a really important thread that kind of goes throughout my works. The stretching of time is a tricky thing to represent musically, but you can do it literally by taking little things and then making them last for a really long time. And you can kind of evoke the sense that time has sort of been suspended a little bit. And as well, the sense that not every player is playing in the same time frame is a really interesting thing to play with. So playing with aleatoric ideas and saying to one person over here, you play in your own time, and one person over here, you play in your own free time, that can lead to a really interesting clash of textures that I think is really, like, that's the really interesting part of music, is when things like that intersect. I love it. Hearing your work played for the first time by an orchestra is a very intense experience. There is nothing that I've ever experienced in my life that is quite the same. It feels monumental, but at the same time, you feel very detail oriented, and I found myself just kind of honing in on one particular player and what they were doing, and that's so interesting that I wrote that part for them. It can be very overwhelming. I guess hearing your work played for the first time by an orchestra is a very, very intense experience. Yeah.